Welcome, fellow seeker of forgotten knowledge. Before we delve into the shadows of medieval medicine, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Whether you're settling in after a long day or perhaps burning the midnight oil, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend these moments with me. If you find yourself drawn to these darker explorations of history's hidden corners, consider subscribing so you never miss a journey into the past. Now, dim the lights, make yourself comfortable. Let your mind drift back to an age when healing and horror walked hand in hand. Picture, if you will, a narrow cobblestone street in 13th century London. The air hangs thick with the acrid smoke of coal fires and something far more unsettling. A wooden sign creaks in the evening breeze, bearing the crude image of a mortar and pestle. Below it, a heavy oak door stands slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of flickering candlelight within. This is the workshop of Master Uldric, apothecary to lords and peasants alike. And tonight, we shall witness the brutal reality of his trade. The life of a medieval apothecary was one of perpetual contradiction. These men and women occupied a strange twilight realm between healer and poisoner, learned scholar and suspected witch. They were simultaneously revered for their knowledge and feared for their power over life and death. To understand their world is to glimpse humanity's desperate struggle against disease, ignorance, and the ever-present specter of mortality that haunted every medieval soul. In our modern age of sterile hospitals and precisely measured pharmaceuticals, it's almost impossible to comprehend the sheer brutality of medieval medicine. The apothecary shop was not the clean, well-lit pharmacy of today, but rather a dimly lit chamber of horrors, where the line between cure and poison was gossamer thin. The very air itself was thick with the choking dust of ground bones, the metallic tang of mercury, the nauseating sweetness of decomposing herbs. Master Uldric rises before dawn each morning, his weathered hands already stained with the residue of yesterday's preparations. The first task of any apothecary's day was to tend to his garden of medicinal plants, many of which would be considered deadly by today's standards. Foxglove, with its beautiful purple blooms and heart-stopping digitalis. Deadly nightshade, its blackberries glistening like dark jewels of death. Hemlock, the same poison that claimed the life of Socrates centuries before. But these were not merely decorative plants. They were the tools of his trade, each one capable of both miraculous healing and agonizing death. The difference between medicine and poison, as the great physician Paracelsus would later observe, lay purely in the dosage. A single miscalculation, a moment's inattention while grinding roots or brewing tinctures, could transform a healing remedy into an instrument of torture. The medieval apothecaries' education was a patchwork of ancient wisdom, religious doctrine, and dangerous experimentation. Most learned their craft through apprenticeship, spending years under the tutelage of a master who jealously guarded his secrets. They studied the classical texts of Galen and Hippocrates, works often corrupted through centuries of copying and translation. They memorized the doctrine of the four humors, that fundamental but flawed understanding of human physiology that would persist for over 1,000 years. Blood, phlegm, yellow, bile, and black bile. These were believed to be the four essential fluids that govern human health and temperament. Too much blood made one sanguine and hot-tempered. An excess of phlegm created a cold, sluggish disposition. Yellow bile brought about choleric anger, while black bile induced melancholic depression. The apothecary's primary task was to restore balance among these humors through purging, bleeding, and the administration of powerful drugs. But the reality of this practice was far more horrifying than the theory suggested. Imagine lying in a medieval sickbed, racked with fever and pain, as the local apothecary approaches with his leather satchel of remedies. His first instinct might be to bleed you, using primitive lancets to open veins and drain what he believes to be corrupted blood. If bleeding fails to bring relief, he might resort to purging, forcing you to vomit or evacuate your bowels with substances so violent they could easily kill a weakened patient. The medieval pharmacopoeia reads like a catalog of horrors. Antimony, a toxic metal used to induce violent vomiting. Mercury administered for everything from syphilis to madness, slowly poisoning patients with each dose. Arsenic, the king of poisons, paradoxically used as a medicine for certain ailments. Lead compounds prescribed for wounds and inflammation, gradually accumulating in the body and causing madness, paralysis, and death. Even the more benign remedies carried their own risks. Opium, derived from poppy sap, was widely used for pain relief, but created devastating addiction. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye, could stop bleeding, but also caused hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrene. Theriac, a supposed universal antidote containing dozens of ingredients, including viper's flesh, was believed to cure everything from plague to poisoning, but was more likely to cause harm than healing. The apothecary's workshop was a place where science and superstition intermingled in the most disturbing ways. Alongside his herbs and minerals, he might stockpile unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk. Sold at astronomical prices, bezoar stones, concretions found in the stomachs of animals, believed to neutralize any poison, and human skull preferably. From someone who had died violently, ground into powder, and used to treat epilepsy and other neurological disorders. The preparation of these remedies was itself a hazardous undertaking. The apothecary worked without protective equipment, breathing in toxic fumes and absorbing dangerous substances through his skin. Mercury vapors slowly destroyed his nervous system. Arsenic dust accumulated in his lungs. Lead-based compounds gradually poisoned his blood. Many apothecaries suffered from the very ailments they sought to cure, their bodies slowly destroying themselves through constant exposure to their own medicines. Consider the daily routine of mixing a simple cough remedy. The apothecary might begin with a base of honey, seemingly innocent enough, but to this, he would add powdered antimony to induce vomiting and clear the chest, a touch of mercury to balance the humors, perhaps some ground pearls for their supposed cooling properties, and a pinch of powdered gold because the wealthy expected expensive ingredients in their medicines. The resulting concoction might indeed suppress a cough, but only because it was slowly poisoning the patient. The social position of the medieval apothecary was as precarious as his profession was dangerous. In an age when medical knowledge was primitive and largely ineffective, any practitioner who dealt in powerful substances was viewed with a mixture of respect and suspicion. The apothecary who successfully treated a lord's ailment might be rewarded with gold and patronage, but the same man could find himself accused of witchcraft or poisoning if his treatments failed, or if he fell afoul of powerful enemies. The Church maintained an uneasy relationship with these practitioners of the healing arts. On one hand, caring for the sick was considered a Christian duty, and many apothecaries were devoutly religious men who saw their work as serving God's will. On the other hand, their extensive knowledge of poisons and their ability to influence life and death made them objects of suspicion. The line between healing and sorcery was thin, and many apothecaries found themselves walking a dangerous tightrope between salvation and damnation. Women who practiced the apothecary's arts faced even greater dangers. Female healers, often called wise women or herb wives, possessed generations of accumulated knowledge about medicinal plants and healing practices. But their gender made them particularly vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. A woman who could ease childbirth pain with ergot might later be accused of causing miscarriages with the same substance. One who cured headaches with willow bark could be charged with causing madness if her treatment failed. The brutal reality of medieval medicine meant that the apothecary's success rate was dismally low by modern standards. Most of their treatments were at best ineffective and at worst actively harmful, yet they persisted in their dangerous calling. Driven by a combination of genuine desire to heal, economic necessity, and the intoxicating power that came from controlling life and death. The plague years of the 14th century brought both opportunity and terror to the apothecary's trade. As the Black Death swept across Europe, killing perhaps 1/3 of the population, desperate people turned to any source of hope, no matter how dubious. Apothecaries found themselves overwhelmed with customers seeking miracle cures, prophylactics, and treatments for the dreaded pestilence. But the plague also exposed the fundamental limitations of medieval medicine. No amount of bloodletting purging, or exotic remedies could stem the tide of death. Many apothecaries themselves fell victim to the disease, either through direct exposure to infected patients or through the stress and exhaustion of treating endless streams of the dying. Those who survived often did so more through luck than skill, though they were quick to claim credit for their survival and that of their patients. The economic pressures facing medieval apothecaries were as brutal as the medical realities. The cost of exotic ingredients was astronomical. A single ounce of genuine saffron might cost more than a laborer's annual wages. Imported spices, precious stones, and rare minerals commanded prices that put them beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest customers. This created a constant temptation to adulterate medicines with cheaper substitutes, a practice that was both dangerous and illegal. But nonetheless, widespread competition among apothecaries was fierce and sometimes deadly. In an age when a reputation for effectiveness could mean the difference between prosperity and starvation, practitioners were not above sabotaging their rivals. Accusations of incompetence, fraud, or witchcraft were common weapons in these professional wars. More direct methods included poisoning competitors or arranging for them to be robbed of their expensive ingredients. The apprenticeship system that governed the apothecary's trade was itself a form of institutionalized brutality. Some as young as 12 or 13 were bound to their masters for terms of 7 years or more. During this time, they were essentially slaves, working long hours for minimal compensation while slowly learning the dangerous secrets of the trade. Many apprentices suffered permanent health damage from exposure to toxic substances. Others died from accidents involving explosive or poisonous materials. The master apothecary held absolute power over his apprentices, with the legal right to beat them for disobedience or incompetence. Sexual abuse was common, but rarely reported, as apprentices had no legal recourse against their masters. The lucky few who survived their apprenticeships and showed aptitude for the trade might eventually be allowed to establish their own practices, but many others found themselves permanently damaged by their experiences, fit only for the most menial tasks in the profession. The tools of the medieval apothecary trade were as crude as they were dangerous. Bronze, mortars, and pestles, often contaminated with lead or other toxic metals, were used to grind ingredients into powder. Primitive balances, accurate only within several grains, made precise dosing nearly impossible. Glass vessels, when available, were expensive and fragile, leading most apothecaries to use containers made of lead, pewter, or other materials that could contaminate their contents. The process of distillation, essential for creating many medicines, was particularly hazardous. Primitive stills, heated over flames, regularly exploded or caught fire. The vapors produced during distillation were often toxic, causing blindness, respiratory damage, or death to those who inhaled them. Many apothecary shops bore the scars of such accidents. With blackened walls and missing windows, testament to the dangers of the trade, storage of ingredients presented its own challenges, without refrigeration or effective preservation techniques. Many medicinal substances quickly spoiled or became contaminated. Herbs might be infested with insects or rodents. Powdered preparations could become adulterated with dust, debris, or the droppings of pests. Even supposedly stable substances like metals and minerals could degrade over time, becoming more or less toxic than expected. The seasonal nature of herb gathering added another layer of difficulty to the apothecary's work. Many medicinal plants had to be harvested at specific times of year, or even specific times of day, to achieve maximum potency. This meant that apothecaries often had to venture into dangerous areas during risky conditions to gather their raw materials. Forest bandits, wild animals, and treacherous terrain claimed the lives of many herb gatherers. The doctrine of signatures, a fundamental principle of medieval medicine, illustrates both the ingenuity and the dangerous delusions of the age. This theory held that God had marked every plant and substance with a sign indicating its medicinal use. Thus walnuts, which resembled the human brain, were used to treat head injuries and mental disorders. Yellow plants like turmeric were prescribed for jaundice, Heart-shaped leaves indicated cardiac remedies. While this system occasionally led to effective treatments, more often it resulted in dangerous misapplications of powerful substances. The apothecary, who followed the doctrine of signatures, might prescribe liver-shaped plants for hepatic disorders, inadvertently poisoning patients with toxic compounds that happened to grow in the right shape. The relationship between apothecaries and physicians was complex and often antagonistic. Physicians, trained in the universities and steeped in classical learning, looked down upon apothecaries as mere tradesmen. Yet they depended upon these same tradesmen to prepare the medicines they prescribed. This created a tension that often erupted into open conflict, with each group blaming the other when treatments failed. Apothecaries, for their part, often possessed more practical knowledge of medicinal substances than the physicians who prescribed them. Many had extensive experience with the actual effects of various drugs, having observed their patients' responses over years of practice. This practical knowledge sometimes conflicted with the theoretical teachings of the physicians, leading to disputes that could have fatal consequences for patients. Caught in the middle, the regulation of the apothecary's trade was haphazard and often corrupt. Guilds attempted to maintain standards and prevent fraud, but their authority was limited and their enforcement sporadic. Licensing requirements varied widely from place to place, and many practitioners operated without any formal authorization. The lack of standardization meant that medicines purchased from different apothecaries might vary wildly in strength and composition, even when supposedly identical. Quality control was virtually non-existent by modern standards. There were no reliable tests for purity or potency, and contamination was endemic. Lead-based compounds might contain varying amounts of the toxic metal. Plant-based medicines could be adulterated with cheaper substitutes or contaminated with poisonous species. Even the most honest apothecary might unknowingly sell dangerous preparations due to the primitive state of analytical chemistry. The psychological toll of the apothecary profession was as severe as the physical dangers. These practitioners lived with the constant knowledge that their next preparation might kill rather than cure. The weight of responsibility for their patients' lives, combined with the knowledge that their treatments were often ineffective or harmful, created enormous stress. Many apothecaries turned to their own medicines for relief, becoming addicted to opium or alcohol in an attempt to cope with the pressures of their calling. The isolation that came with specialized knowledge also took its toll. Apothecaries possessed secrets that set them apart from ordinary people, but they also lived with the constant fear that this knowledge might be turned against them. In an age of superstition and scapegoating, anyone who dealt with poisons and mysterious powders was a potential target for accusations of witchcraft or murder. As we draw this first glimpse into the medieval apothecary's world to a close, we begin to see the true brutality of their existence. These were not the wise healers of romantic fiction, but desperate practitioners struggling with primitive tools and dangerous substances. In a world where medical knowledge was scarce and superstition was rampant, their lives were marked by constant exposure to toxic materials. The stress of life and death decisions made with inadequate knowledge, and the ever-present threat of legal, social, or professional destruction. Yet within this darkness, there flickered the first sparks of what would eventually become modern medicine. The medieval apothecary's willingness to experiment with new substances, despite the personal risks involved, laid the groundwork for future pharmaceutical advances. Their careful observation of drug effects, however crude their methods, contributed to humanity's slowly growing understanding of how medicines work. Their dedication to healing, however misguided their methods might seem today, represented an essential step in the long journey toward effective medical treatment. The brutal reality of being a medieval apothecary was that it required a unique combination of courage, desperation, and perhaps a touch of madness to persist in such a dangerous calling. These practitioners risked their health, their sanity, and their lives in pursuit of the ancient dream of conquering disease and death. Most failed, often spectacularly, but their failures taught lessons that would eventually benefit all humanity. As you settle into sleep tonight, perhaps you'll spare a thought for these forgotten figures who labored in the shadows of history. Their world was one of constant peril, where a single mistake could mean the difference between healing and harm, between salvation and damnation. Now that we've delved deep into the treacherous world of medieval apothecaries, we must confront perhaps the most harrowing reality of their existence, the psychological toll of their profession. Each dawn brought not just another day of work, but another descent into a realm where death and salvation danced on the edge of a pestle. The medieval apothecary's mind was a battlefield, constantly torn between hope and despair, between the intoxicating power to heal and the crushing weight of inevitable failure. Consider the mental anguish of preparing remedies for the plague-stricken. Day after day, apothecaries would mix their concoctions of theory and trial, knowing full well that for every patient who might recover, 10 more would perish in agony. The screams of the dying echoed through their workshops as they ground mercury and antimony, their hands trembling not just from the toxic fumes, but from the knowledge that they were often hastening death rather than preventing it. The isolation was perhaps even more crushing than the physical dangers. Apothecaries existed in a twilight world between the learned and the ignorant, trusted by neither physicians nor common folk. Physicians viewed them as mere tradesmen, lacking the classical education and theoretical knowledge that true healing required. Yet the common people saw them as dangerous conjurers wielding mysterious powers that could just as easily curse as cure. This social exile bred a peculiar form of madness, a paranoid hypervigilance that consumed many practitioners. Sleep offered no respite from their torment. Night after night, apothecaries would lie awake, haunted by the faces of those they had failed to save, the merchant's wife who had begged for something, anything, to ease her child's fever, only to watch the babe convulse and die from the very remedy meant to heal. The young knight whose infected wound had festered despite their most potent salves, eventually claiming his leg and then his life. These failures accumulated like stones in the soul, each one adding to the crushing weight of guilt and self-doubt. The constant exposure to human suffering created a form of emotional callousness that was both protective and destructive. Apothecaries learned to view their patients not as fellow human beings, but as puzzles to be solved, symptoms to be catalogued. This detachment allowed them to function in the face of overwhelming tragedy, but it also severed them from the very humanity they sought to preserve. Many became cold, calculating figures, more concerned with the intellectual challenge of their craft than with the welfare of those who sought their aid. The financial pressures only compounded their psychological burden. Unlike physicians who served the wealthy and could command substantial fees, apothecaries depended on a steady stream of desperate customers. They were forced to balance their genuine desire to heal with the harsh reality that they needed to make a living. This led to ethical compromises that ate away at their souls, selling ineffective remedies to the gullible, charging exorbitant prices for life-saving medicines, or deliberately creating dependencies to ensure repeat customers. The apprenticeship system, while providing essential training, also perpetuated cycles of abuse and trauma. Master apothecaries, themselves broken by years of failure and frustration, would take out their rage on their young charges. Apprentices were beaten for minor mistakes, forced to handle dangerous substances without protection, and subjected to verbal abuse that would crush their spirits long before their bodies gave out. Those who survived often became masters themselves, perpetuating the same cycle of cruelty they had endured. The religious implications of their work created another layer of psychological torment. The Church taught that illness was often a punishment for sin, a trial sent by God to test faith or purge the soul of wickedness. By attempting to interfere with this divine judgment, apothecaries risked not only their earthly lives, but their eternal souls. The constant fear of damnation hung over every preparation, every treatment, every moment of their professional existence. Women in the field faced additional psychological burdens. The constant threat of accusations of witchcraft meant they lived in perpetual fear, knowing that a single unsuccessful treatment or the enmity of a powerful neighbor could lead to their torture and execution. This paranoia infected every aspect of their lives, making them suspicious of potential customers, wary of sharing knowledge, and reluctant to form the professional relationships that might have provided emotional support. The lack of scientific Understanding meant that apothecaries were essentially working in the dark, guided by superstition and tradition rather than empirical knowledge. They had no way to predict which remedies might work or why others failed catastrophically. This uncertainty created a form of learned helplessness where even the most experienced practitioners felt like they were simply throwing remedies at the wall and hoping something would stick. The seasonal nature of many diseases created cycles of hope and despair that were emotionally devastating. Spring would bring optimism as the plague seemed to recede. It's only to have summer crush that hope as new outbreaks ravaged communities. Winter offered a brief respite from infectious diseases, but brought its own challenges as respiratory ailments and malnutrition claimed the weak and elderly. Each cycle reinforced the apothecary's sense of powerlessness against the inexorable forces of disease and death. Many apothecaries turned to their own concoctions for relief from psychological pain. Opium, alcohol, and various herbal preparations offered temporary escape from the crushing weight of their responsibilities. However, this self-medication often led to addiction, further compromising their judgment and effectiveness. Some became so dependent on these substances that they could barely function without them, their hands shaking not from mercury poisoning but from withdrawal symptoms. The competitive nature of the profession created additional stress. Apothecaries were constantly fighting for customers, often resorting to underhanded tactics to discredit their rivals. They would spread rumors about competitors' failures, steal trade secrets, or even sabotage each other's preparations. This atmosphere of mistrust and hostility meant that practitioners who desperately needed professional support and camaraderie found themselves isolated and embattled. The rapid changes in medical theory during the later medieval period created cognitive dissonance that many apothecaries found unbearable. Remedies that had been considered effective for generations were suddenly deemed harmful or useless. New theories contradicted everything they had been taught, forcing them to question not only their methods, but their entire understanding of the human body and disease. This constant upheaval left many feeling lost and confused, unsure of what to believe or how to practice. The social stigma attached to their profession extended to their families, creating additional emotional burdens. Apothecaries' children were often ostracized by their peers, viewed with suspicion and fear. Their spouses lived in constant anxiety, knowing that their partner's work could bring danger to the entire household. This isolation extended beyond the workshop into every aspect of their personal lives. Despite these overwhelming psychological challenges, many apothecaries found ways to cope and even thrive. Some turned to scholarly pursuits, finding solace in the systematic study of plants and minerals. Others formed secret societies or guilds, where they could share knowledge and provide mutual support. A few found redemption in focusing on the patients they did manage to help, holding on to these successes as anchors in the storm of their profession. The psychological legacy of medieval apothecaries echoes through the centuries, reminding us of the human cost of medical progress. Their struggles with uncertainty, ethical dilemmas, professional isolation mirror many of the challenges faced by healthcare workers today. The profession of medieval apothecary was already brutal enough without the added burden of social ostracism that inevitably followed those who dared to practice the healing arts. While clan chiefs commanded respect through sword and shield, and priests wielded authority through scripture and sacrament, the apothecary occupied a precarious middle ground between salvation and damnation, between miracle worker and accused. Which consider the daily reality of someone like Agnes the Herbwoman, who operated from a cramped stone cottage on the outskirts of a highland village in the 14th century. Her world was one of constant suspicion and whispered accusations. When the blacksmith's wife recovered from a fever after taking Agnes's willow bark tincture, she was praised as a blessed healer. But when old Malcolm died despite her ministrations, the same villagers who had sought her aid now crossed themselves and muttered about dark dealings with Satan. The social isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the apothecary's existence. They were simultaneously essential and reviled, needed desperately, yet kept at arm's length by a superstitious populace. Agnes would rise each morning, knowing that her very presence in the village marketplace would cause mothers to clutch their children closer and merchants to avert their eyes. The knowledge that had taken her decades to accumulate through painful trial and error, through studying the movements of the stars and the properties of countless plants, was viewed by many as evidence of unholy communion with demonic forces. This isolation was compounded by the constant threat of accusation. In a world where disease and misfortune were often attributed to supernatural causes, the apothecary made an inconvenient scapegoat. When crops failed or livestock sickened, when children were stillborn or plague swept through the settlement, fingers inevitably pointed toward those who trafficked in mysterious powders and arcane knowledge. Agnes had seen it happen to her mentor, old Morag, who was dragged from her home one winter night and burned at the stake after being accused of cursing the laird's cattle. The fear was not entirely unfounded, for the line between healing and harming was razor thin in the medieval world. The same foxglove that could steady an irregular heartbeat could just as easily stop it entirely. The nightshade that brought relief from pain in tiny doses became a deadly poison when the measurements were wrong. Agnes carried this terrible responsibility with her always, knowing that a single miscalculation could transform her from healer to murderer in the eyes of her community, even among their own kind. Apothecaries struggled with professional jealousy and competition. The arrival of a new practitioner in the area meant not just rivalry for patients, but the very real possibility of being denounced as a fraud or worse. Agnes had once welcomed a traveling monk who claimed knowledge of Arabic medical texts, only to discover him spreading rumors about her supposed dealings with evil spirits. Such betrayals were common in a profession where trust was a luxury few could afford. The relationship with the established church added another layer of complexity to the apothecary's social standing. While some progressive clerics recognized the value of herbal medicine and even collaborated with skilled practitioners, many viewed any healing that occurred outside the bounds of prayer and divine intervention as inherently suspect. Agnes had learned to tread carefully around the local priest, Father Duncan, who oscillated between grudging acceptance of her work and open hostility, depending on his mood and the political climate. The economic precariousness of the profession only intensified the social pressures. Unlike the clan chief, who extracted wealth through force, or the merchant, who accumulated riches through trade, apothecaries' income depended entirely on the goodwill of people who simultaneously feared and needed them. Payment often came in the form of meager offerings, a few eggs here, a handful of grain, there barely enough to sustain life. Agnes had spent countless nights going to bed hungry, her stomach cramping with emptiness, while she tended to patients who could offer nothing more than promises to pray for her soul. The gender dynamics within the profession created additional obstacles for female practitioners like Agnes, while men who practiced medicine might be viewed with suspicion. Women faced the added burden of centuries-old associations between femininity and witchcraft. The very qualities that made them effective healers, their intuitive understanding of herbal properties, their gentle bedside manner, their ability to ease the pain of childbirth, were often reinterpreted as evidence of supernatural powers. Agnes had learned to downplay her successes and emphasize her failures, lest she appeared too skilled for a mere mortal woman. The constant stress of living under such scrutiny took its toll on the mind as well as the body. Many apothecaries developed what we might now recognize as anxiety disorders. Jumping at shadows and interpreting every sideways glance as a potential threat, Agnes had begun talking to herself during long hours of preparation, finding comfort in the sound of her own voice. In the oppressive silence of her workshop, sleep came fitfully, interrupted by nightmares of accusation and execution. Yet perhaps the cruelest irony was that this very isolation often drove apothecaries toward the darker practices their accusers imagined, cut off from normal human relationships. And driven to desperation by poverty and persecution, some did indeed turn to less savory means of survival. Agnes had heard whispers of practitioners who sold love potions to desperate suitors or provided poisons to wives seeking freedom from brutal husbands. The line between healer and poisoner became increasingly blurred when society offered no legitimate path to acceptance and prosperity. The few relationships that apothecaries could maintain were often with others who existed on the margins of medieval society. Agnes found kinship with the village's wise women, the midwives who delivered babies in the dark hours before dawn, the hermits who lived in the forest and claimed to commune with nature spirits. These informal networks provided some measure of emotional support and practical collaboration, though they also reinforced the perception that all such practitioners were somehow outside the bounds of Christian civilization. Children of apothecaries faced their own unique challenges growing up in households marked by suspicion and fear. Agnes had never married, partly from choice, but partly because few men were willing to associate themselves with someone whose very livelihood marked her as potentially dangerous. She watched the children of her few colleagues struggle with their inherited burden, some fleeing to distant lands to escape their family's reputation, others embracing the dark arts their parents had been falsely accused of practicing. The cumulative effect of this social ostracism was a profound sense of alienation that permeated every aspect of the apothecaries' existence. They were simultaneously insiders and outsiders, essential members of their communities who were never truly accepted or embraced. Agnes would stand at her cottage window in the evenings, watching the warm glow emanating from other homes. Her families gathered around hearth fires, sharing meals and stories, and the simple comfort of human companionship. Her own dwelling remained cold and dark, illuminated only by the flickering flame of a single candle and the eerie phosphorescence of her bubbling preparations. This isolation bred a particular kind of resilience, hardened self-reliance born of necessity rather than choice. Apothecaries learned to find satisfaction in their work itself, rather than in the recognition or gratitude of others. Agnes took pride in the perfect preparation of a difficult tincture, in the successful treatment of a seemingly hopeless case, in the gradual accumulation of knowledge that made her more effective with each passing year. These small victories sustained her through the long nights of solitude and the daily reminders of her status as an unwelcome necessity. The social ostracism also fostered a deep empathy for other outcasts and marginalized individuals. Agnes found herself drawn to treating the poorest members of society, the beggars and criminals who had nothing to offer in payment, but who reminded her of her own precarious position. She understood intimately what it meant to be judged and found wanting by a society that claimed to value Christian charity while practicing something quite different. As the medieval period progressed and the Renaissance began to dawn on the horizon, some apothecaries would find their knowledge valued and their social standing improved. But for practitioners like Agnes, laboring in the remote Highland villages of 14th-century Scotland, social acceptance remained as elusive as the philosopher's stone itself. Looking at this brutal medieval landscape, we now turn to one of the most dangerous yet essential trades of the time, the apothecary. These practitioners occupied a precarious position, walking the razor's edge between healer and poisoner, salvation and damnation. The apothecary's workshop was a chamber of wonders and horrors. Clay pots lined rough wooden shelves, each containing substances that could either cure or kill. Mercury gleamed silver and deadly in its vessel, promising relief from the French pox, yet slowly poisoning those who dared consume it. Arsenic, ground to a fine white powder, sat innocuously beside herbs that could ease a fevered brow or stop a heart forever. These men and women lived with death as their constant companion. It's not just from the diseases they sought to treat, but from their own remedies. The very substances they handled daily were slowly destroying them from within. Lead-based compounds left their minds addled and their bodies trembling. The vapors from their preparations burned their lungs and clouded their vision. Many apothecaries bore the telltale signs of their trade: blackened fingernails from handling mercury, the pale complexion of arsenic poisoning, the tremor of lead toxicity. The line between medicine and poison was gossamer thin in medieval Scotland. What healed in small doses killed in larger ones, and determining that crucial difference often meant the difference between being hailed as a miracle worker or burned as a witch. Foxglove could slow a racing heart or stop it entirely. Belladonna might ease pain or induce deadly hallucinations. Hemlock could treat nervous disorders or deliver an agonizing death. Consider the plight of Agnes, third wife, who plied her trade in the shadow of Edinburgh Castle in the late 14th century. She had learned her craft from her grandmother, who had learned it from hers, passing down knowledge through whispered secrets and carefully guarded recipes. Agnes knew which mushrooms would ease the pain of childbirth and which would send a soul screaming into the afterlife. She understood the delicate balance of tinctures and teas, the precise measurements that separated healing from harm. But knowledge was a dangerous thing for a woman in medieval Scotland. When the merchant's wife died after taking one of Annis's remedies for barrenness, fingers pointed and tongues wagged. The very success of her treatments became evidence of dark dealings. How could a mere woman, they whispered, possess such power over life and death unless she had made a pact with the devil himself? The tools of the apothecary trade were crude by our standards, yet marvels of ingenuity for their time. Mortars and pestles ground substances to powder, their surfaces worn smooth by countless hours of grinding. Scales attempted to measure precise doses, though their accuracy left much to be desired. Distillation apparatus cobbled together from clay pots and metal tubes extracted essences and concentrated poisons with equal facility. The apothecary's day began before dawn, gathering herbs while the dew still clung to their leaves. They knew that certain plants were most potent when harvested at specific times, some at the full moon, others during the dark of night. This nocturnal wandering only added to their sinister reputation among the God-fearing populace. What honest Christian, the villagers wondered, skulks about in darkness, gathering strange plants? The preparation of medicines was a dangerous dance with death. Grinding cinnabar to extract mercury filled the air with toxic vapors. Boiling down lead acetate, known as sugar of lead for its sweet taste, created fumes that slowly poisoned the lungs. Many apothecaries worked in poorly ventilated spaces, breathing in the very toxins they sought to refine. Their workshops became chambers of slow suicide. Each day's work adding another layer of poison to their bodies. The psychological toll was perhaps even more devastating than the physical one. Every remedy carried the weight of potential catastrophe. Miscalculation, a moment's inattention, a contaminated ingredient could transform a healing draught into a death sentence. Sleep brought no respite, for their dreams were haunted by the faces of those they had failed to save. They saw again the child who had convulsed and died after taking their fever remedy, the woman who had bled to death despite their best efforts to staunch the flow. Each failure was a potential death sentence, for in a world where cause and effect were poorly understood, any death following treatment could be laid at the apothecary's feet. The loneliness of their profession was crushing. Other tradesmen could gather in guilds, sharing knowledge and finding fellowship. But apothecaries guarded their secrets jealously, knowing that sharing the wrong information with the wrong person could lead to accusations of teaching witchcraft. They worked in isolation, trusted by none, suspected by all. Women in the profession faced even greater perils. While male physicians might be seen as learned practitioners, women with similar knowledge were viewed with deep suspicion. The very healing abilities that should have brought respect instead brought accusations of supernatural influence. Too many successful treatments, and they risked being branded as witches. Too many failures, and they faced charges of incompetence or malice. The economic pressures were relentless. The wealthy could afford to pay well for exotic remedies, but they were also the most dangerous customers. A treatment that failed a noble could result in charges of treason or attempted murder. The poor, who formed the majority of their clientele, could barely afford to pay at all. Many apothecaries eked out a living on the edge of poverty, their dangerous knowledge bringing little material reward. Training in the profession was a brutal affair. Apprentices, often children of 10 or 12, were exposed to toxic substances from their first day. They learned by handling mercury with their bare hands, by grinding arsenic without protection, by breathing in the fumes of countless preparations. Many died before completing their training, their small bodies unable to withstand the constant assault of poisons. Those who survived the apprenticeship bore the marks of their education for life, tremors from mercury poisoning, scars from caustic burns, respiratory ailments from inhaling toxic vapors. These were the badges of their trade. Knowledge they gained came at the cost of their own health. Each lesson learned through suffering. The superstitions surrounding their work were both blessing and curse. Some believed that apothecaries possessed the evil eye, able to curse enemies with a glance. Others thought they could transform base metals into gold or brew love potions that could enslave the heart. These beliefs brought customers seeking impossible cures, but also attracted the attention of those who saw such powers as evidence of diabolic influence. The Church's relationship with apothecaries was complex and contradictory. While officially condemning anything that smacked of witchcraft or sorcery, many monasteries maintained their own herb gardens and employed learned monks as healers. The line between acceptable Christian healing and forbidden pagan practice was often drawn arbitrarily, leaving apothecaries vulnerable to changing clerical opinions. Political upheavals brought their own dangers. In times of war or unrest, apothecaries might be pressed into service to treat wounded soldiers, exposing them to battlefield diseases and the ever-present risk of being caught in the crossfire. Their knowledge of poisons also made them valuable and dangerous to those plotting against enemies. Many found themselves unwilling participants in assassination schemes, threatened with death if they refused to provide the means for murder. The seasonal nature of their work added another layer of uncertainty. Summer brought fresh herbs and the ability to gather ingredients, but it also brought the diseases that flourished in warm weather. Winter meant relying on dried stores and preserved medicines, often of questionable potency. Spring brought hope for new growth, but also the hungry times when both healer and patient struggled to survive until the harvest. Yet despite these overwhelming challenges, some apothecaries managed not only to survive, but to advance the crude beginnings of medical knowledge. They experimented with new combinations of herbs, developed better methods of preparation, and slowly began to understand which treatments actually worked and which were mere superstition. Their careful observations, often recorded in cipher, to protect their secrets, laid the groundwork for future medical advances. The courage required to practice this profession was immense. Every day brought the possibility of accusation, imprisonment, torture, or death. Yet they continued their work, driven by a mixture of compassion, curiosity, and sheer necessity. In a world where physicians were rare and expensive, the local apothecary was often the only hope for the sick and suffering. Their legacy is written, not in grand histories, but in the lives they saved and the knowledge they preserved. Through their dangerous experiments and careful observations, they began the long journey from superstition to science, from magic to medicine. They paid a terrible price for this progress, sacrificing their health, their safety, and often their lives in pursuit of healing knowledge. As we continue our exploration of these remarkable yet tragic figures, we begin to see how their work laid the foundations for our modern understanding of pharmaceuticals and medicine. Yet perhaps no aspect of the apothecary's existence was more terrifying than the social stigma that followed them. Like a shadow through the narrow streets of medieval towns. To the common folk, these practitioners of the healing arts occupied a precarious position between savior and sorcerer, their very knowledge marking them as suspects in the eyes of those who feared what they could not understand. Picture Thomas, the herb gatherer, hunched over his mortar and pestle in the dim candlelight of his workshop, grinding dried mandrake root into powder. The acrid smoke from his brazier mingles with the musty scent of hanging herbs, creating an atmosphere that would seem mystical and otherworldly to any passerby peering through his shuttered windows. To the superstitious townspeople, such scenes were indistinguishable from witchcraft. The line between healing and hexing was razor-thin in the medieval mind. Apothecaries walked that line every day of their working lives. Women practitioners faced even harsher scrutiny. Take the case of Eleanina, a wise woman whose knowledge of birthing herbs and fever remedies made her invaluable to the women of her village. Yet this same expertise painted a target on her back when the harvest failed, and cattle began dying mysteriously. Whispers spread like wildfire through the settlement. Why did Eleanina's garden flourish when others withered? How did she know? Which roots would ease a difficult birth? Surely such knowledge could only come from Congress with dark forces. The Church, that omnipresent force in medieval life, viewed apothecaries with deep suspicion. Church doctrine held that illness was God's will, a test of faith or punishment for sin. To interfere with divine judgment through the use of herbs and potions was to challenge the very order of creation. Priests thundered from pulpits about the dangers of seeking healing from anyone other than God himself, warning their flocks that those who trafficked in remedies might well be trafficking with the devil. This religious hostility created a constant atmosphere of paranoia for medieval apothecaries. They had to be extraordinarily careful about when and how they practiced their craft. Many worked only under cover of darkness, slipping through back alleys to tend to the sick and dying. Others disguised their activities as simple herb selling, downplaying their medical knowledge to avoid drawing unwanted attention from church authorities. The guild system, which provided structure and protection for other medieval tradesmen, offered little solace to apothecaries. Unlike blacksmiths or carpenters, whose skills were clearly defined and socially accepted, apothecaries existed in a gray area between legitimate trade and forbidden practice. Some cities allowed apothecary guilds to form, but these organizations were weak and constantly under threat. Guild membership was expensive. Many practicing apothecaries were too poor or too to afford the fees and political connections required for acceptance, even those fortunate enough to gain guild membership found themselves bound by restrictive regulations designed more to appease church authorities than to advance the healing arts. Guild apothecaries were forbidden from treating certain conditions deemed too serious for their intervention. They could not perform surgery, set bones, or treat diseases of the mind. Most significantly, they were prohibited from practicing during certain holy periods, leaving the sick and dying without recourse during some of the most dangerous times of the medieval year. The economic pressures facing medieval apothecaries were crushing and unrelenting. Unlike modern pharmacists who work with standardized medications and predictable supply chains, medieval apothecaries had to source their own ingredients, often traveling dangerous distances to gather rare plants or trade with suspicious merchants. The cost of materials was enormous, yet they served primarily the poor who could rarely afford to pay adequate fees for treatment. Consider the plight of Master Robert, an apothecary working in a medium-sized English town during the 14th century. His shop rent consumed nearly half his income, yet he dared not relocate to cheaper quarters lest he lose what little respectability his central location provided. The cost of importing exotic ingredients like cinnamon, pepper, and various Eastern herbs required him to maintain relationships with merchants who often demanded payment up front for goods that might never arrive. Pirates, storms, and political upheavals regularly destroyed entire shipments, leaving Robert financially ruined and unable to treat patients who depended on these rare substances. Local ingredients presented their own challenges. Robert had to maintain extensive knowledge not just of which plants to gather, but when and where to find them. Spring herbs needed to be collected at dawn when their potency was highest. Autumn roots required careful timing to avoid the first frost that would destroy their medicinal properties. This seasonal dependency meant that apothecaries often had only brief windows to gather a year's supply of crucial ingredients. A single missed opportunity could spell disaster for both practitioner and patient. The physical demands of ingredient collection were brutal and dangerous. Apothecaries like Robert spent countless hours trudging through marshes and forests, climbing rocky hillsides and venturing into areas where bandits and wild animals posed constant threats. The healing herbs they sought often grew in the most inaccessible locations, as if nature itself was testing the dedication of those who would unlock its secrets. Many apothecaries suffered severe injuries during these gathering expeditions. Broken bones from falls, infected wounds from thorns and animal bites, and exposure-related illnesses were occupational hazards that no amount of herbal knowledge could entirely prevent. Some never returned from their ingredient hunting journeys, their fate known only to the ravens and wolves that claimed their bodies in remote wilderness areas. The preservation and storage of collected ingredients presented another layer of complexity and expense. Without refrigeration or modern preservation techniques, Apothecaries had to master the arts of drying, salting, smoking, and oil-based preservation to keep their materials potent throughout the year. Improper storage could not only render expensive ingredients useless, but could also create dangerous toxins that might poison rather than heal patients. Robert's workshop was a testament to this constant battle against decay and contamination. Bundles of dried herbs hung from every rafter, their papery leaves rustling with each draft of air. Lay jars lined wooden shelves, each carefully sealed, with wax and labeled with cryptic symbols that only Robert could decipher. The air was thick with the competing scents of preservative oils, dried flowers, and the ever-present threat of mold that could destroy months of careful preparation in a matter of days. The psychological toll of this precarious existence was devastating. Apothecaries lived in constant fear, not just of professional failure, but of personal destruction. A single accusation of witchcraft could result in torture, execution, and the complete obliteration of everything they had worked to build. Family members were often shunned by association, and children of accused apothecaries found themselves marked as suspicious from birth. This fear created a culture of secrecy and isolation within the apothecary community. Practitioners were reluctant to share knowledge or techniques, fearful that too much information in the wrong hands could be used against them. The natural human desire for professional collaboration and advancement was stifled by the need for self-preservation, slowing the development of medical knowledge and ensuring that valuable discoveries often died with their creators. Sleep came fitfully to medieval apothecaries, haunted by nightmares of failed treatments and vengeful accusations. Every knock at the door might bring a desperate patient or an arresting constable. Every successful cure raised their profile and increased their danger. Every failure brought them closer to the stake or the gallows. They lived suspended between hope and terror, their days measured not in profits or professional satisfaction, but in simple survival. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their existence. While other medieval craftsmen could find camaraderie in their guilds and communities, apothecaries were perpetually outsiders, too valuable to completely exile, but too dangerous to fully embrace. They attended church services where priests spoke against their very livelihood. They walked through markets where former patients might either bless or curse their names, depending on the outcome of their treatments. Many apothecaries developed elaborate rituals and superstitions to cope with this psychological pressure. Some would only work during certain phases of the moon, believing that lunar influence could protect them from accusations of supernatural manipulation. Others maintained careful records of their treatments, hoping that documentation might serve as evidence of their legitimate medical intentions rather than evidence of occult practices. The constant stress took a severe physical toll as well. Contemporary accounts describe apothecaries as prematurely aged, their hair gray before their time, their hands shaking not just from mercury poisoning but from chronic anxiety. Many developed nervous tics and compulsive behaviors, checking and rechecking their preparations, obsessively cleaning their workshops, and rehearsing explanations for their activities in case they were ever called to account for their actions. Yet, despite all these hardships and dangers, medieval apothecaries persisted in their calling. Whether driven by genuine compassion, intellectual curiosity, or simple economic necessity, they continued to practice their perilous craft in the face of overwhelming opposition. Their determination to heal and help, even at enormous personal cost, represents one of the most remarkable examples of human perseverance in the face of institutional hostility and social persecution. This persistence would ultimately prove crucial to the advancement of human knowledge and the development of modern medicine. Every risk they took, every experiment they conducted, and every observation they recorded contributed to the slow but steady accumulation of medical understanding that would eventually transform human health and longevity. The medieval apothecary workshop was a theater of constant peril, where the very remedies meant to heal could just as easily become instruments of death. In this shadowy realm between medicine and poison, the apothecary walked a razor's edge each day, surrounded by substances that could cure a fever or stop a heart with equal efficiency. But perhaps even more treacherous than the toxic fumes and Volatile compounds were the social and economic forces that conspired to make their existence a perpetual struggle for survival. The apothecary trade demanded an encyclopedic knowledge of hundreds of plants, minerals, and animal-derived substances, each with their own specific properties, dosages, and contraindications. Mercury, a cornerstone of medieval medicine, could treat skin conditions in minute quantities, but would slowly poison the apothecary who handled it daily. Lead-based compounds promised to cure everything from headaches to hysteria, yet their cumulative effects would manifest as tremors, madness, and eventual death. The irony was not lost on these practitioners that the very substances they used to heal others were slowly destroying their own bodies. Even the seemingly innocent herbs posed their own dangers. Foxglove, prized for its ability to strengthen a failing heart, contained digitalis compounds that could prove fatal if the dosage was miscalculated by even the smallest margin. Belladonna, the beautiful lady, could dilate pupils for cosmetic purposes or plunge a patient into a coma from which they would never wake. Monk's hood, wolfsbane, hemlock, these were not merely ingredients, but potential weapons that required the steady hand of an expert and the wisdom of someone who understood that the line between medicine and murder was often thinner than a blade of grass. The constant exposure to these hazardous materials took a devastating toll on the apothecary's health. Many developed what we would now recognize as chronic heavy metal poisoning, their hands shaking uncontrollably, their minds clouded by confusion and memory loss. The mercury vapors that rose from their preparations would settle in their lungs, in brain tissue, causing a slow deterioration that they were powerless to prevent. Lead dust, invisible and odorless, would accumulate in their bones and organs, leading to kidney failure, neurological damage, and premature death. But the physical dangers were only part of the story. The medieval apothecary operated in a world where the church viewed their practices with deep suspicion and outright hostility. The preparation of remedies, especially those involving rare or exotic ingredients, could easily be construed as witchcraft, or heretical dabbling in forbidden knowledge. The very books they studied, with their arcane symbols and mysterious formulas, were seen as potential grimoires containing diabolic secrets rather than medical texts. This religious persecution was not merely theoretical. Records from across medieval Europe tell of apothecaries hauled before ecclesiastical courts, accused of consorting with demons or practicing black magic. Their workshops filled with strange vessels, bubbling concoctions, and dried animal parts seemed to the ignorant masses like the very dens of Satan himself. The skull of a hanged man used to create powder for treating epilepsy, the preserved organs of various beasts, the cryptic symbols marking different preparations. All of these could be construed as evidence of diabolical practice by those seeking a scapegoat for their community's suffering. Master Uldrich learned this harsh lesson when a series of patients died despite his ministrations during a particularly virulent outbreak of sweating sickness. Grieving families, desperate for someone to blame for their losses, began to whisper that the apothecary's remedies were not healing but cursing their loved ones. The whispers grew to accusations, and soon Uldrich found himself dragged before the local bishop charged with practicing malefic magic and consorting with demons. Only his reputation for piety and the testimony of several prominent citizens he had successfully treated saved him from the stake. But the experience left him shaken and constantly looking over his shoulder. The social ostracism extended beyond mere suspicion of witchcraft. Apothecaries occupied an uncomfortable position in medieval society. Two learned to be considered mere tradesmen, yet lacking the formal education and social standing of university-trained physicians. They were caught in a professional limbo, looked down upon by the medical establishment as mere shopkeepers peddling folk remedies, while simultaneously being viewed with suspicion by the common people they served. This isolation was compounded by the fact that their work often required them to handle the most repulsive aspects of human suffering, draining infected wounds, collecting urine for diagnostic purposes, and preparing medicines from substances that would turn the stomach of lesser men. The economic realities of the apothecary's trade added another layer of misery to their existence. The ingredients required for their preparations were often fantastically expensive, sourced from distant lands through treacherous trade routes. A single ounce of genuine theriac, that legendary curare supposedly containing viper's flesh and dozens of exotic herbs, could cost more than a craftsman's monthly wages. Saffron, prized for its supposed ability to lift melancholy and strengthen the heart, was literally worth its weight in gold. Many apothecaries found themselves bankrupt from attempting to stock their shops with genuine ingredients, forced to resort to substitutions and adulterations that they knew were less effective but were all they could afford. This economic pressure led to one of the most soul-crushing aspects of the apothecary's existence: the constant knowledge that they were often selling false hope to desperate people. When a mother brought her dying child to the shop, clutching her few precious coins and begging for a miracle cure, what was the apothecary to do? Turn her away empty-handed and watch the child die, or sell her a preparation that might provide some small comfort, even if it lacked the potent ingredients that might actually help? The weight of these daily moral compromises wore heavily on the conscience of any practitioner who retained a shred of humanity. The competition within the profession was vicious and unforgiving. In larger cities, dozens of apothecaries might vie for the same pool of customers, leading to price wars that drove many to ruin. Some resorted to spreading malicious rumors about their competitors, claiming that rival shops sold inferior or even dangerous preparations. Others attempted to steal trade secrets or poach apprentices who had learned valuable techniques. The pressure to maintain a competitive edge led many apothecaries to make increasingly outlandish claims about their remedies, promising cures for everything from baldness to barrenness, from madness to mortality itself. Perhaps most tragically, the very people who dedicated their lives to healing were often powerless to help their own families when disease struck close to home. Master Uldrick watched helplessly as his own wife succumbed to childbed fever, despite his desperate attempts to save her with every remedy in his arsenal.
Ow.
The irony was crushing. Here was a man who had saved dozens of lives, yet he could not preserve the one that mattered most to him. The guilt and self-recrimination that followed such personal failures often drove apothecaries to despair, leading some to abandon their calling entirely or to seek solace in the very substances they dispensed to others. The apprenticeship system that governed the trade was itself a form of institutionalized suffering. Young boys, often from poor families seeking any opportunity for advancement, would be bound to master apothecaries for terms of 7 years or more. During this time, they were little better than slaves, subjected to backbreaking labor, constant criticism, and exposure to the same toxic substances that would eventually claim their health. They ground minerals until their hands bled, tended furnaces that seared their skin, and breathed in poisonous fumes day after day, all while receiving barely enough food to sustain life and sleeping in cramped quarters that were often little more than closets. The apprentices learned their trade through a brutal process of trial and error, with mistakes often resulting in severe beatings or extension of their terms of service. They were expected to memorize hundreds of recipes and procedures, yet were rarely taught the underlying principles that might have helped them understand why certain treatments worked while others failed. The knowledge was passed down as a series of rigid formulas and superstitions, creating a generation of practitioners who could follow instructions but lacked the flexibility to adapt when circumstances demanded innovation. Many apprentices never survived to become journeymen, falling victim to accidents, poisoning, or the numerous diseases that swept through medieval cities with depressing regularity. Those who did complete their training often emerged as broken men, their health shattered by years of exposure to toxic substances, and their spirits crushed by the constant reminder of their powerlessness in the face of human suffering. Yet, still they continued, driven by the faint hope that their work might make some small difference in a world that seemed designed to inflict maximum misery upon its inhabitants. The psychological toll of the apothecary's calling cannot be overstated. Day after day, they witnessed the full spectrum of human suffering, the agonized cries of patients undergoing primitive surgical procedures without anesthesia, the desperate pleas of parents watching their children waste away from diseases they could neither understand nor cure. the silent resignation of the elderly as they prepared for death. The constant exposure to pain, fear, desperation wore away at the apothecary's soul like water wearing away stone. Leaving many emotionally numb and spiritually exhausted, sleep, when it came at all, was often plagued by nightmares, filled with the faces of patients they had failed to save. The weight of responsibility was crushing. Every death felt like a personal failure. Every unsuccessful treatment a mark against their competence and character. Some apothecaries developed a protective callousness, learning to view their patients as mere problems to be solved rather than suffering human beings. But this emotional armor came at the cost of their own humanity. The isolation inherent in the profession compounded these psychological burdens. Apothecaries were often the only people in their communities with any real understanding of disease and treatment, leaving them intellectually isolated and unable to share their frustrations and failures with others who might understand. Carried the terrible knowledge of how limited their abilities truly were, how much of their success depended on luck rather than skill, and how often their best efforts resulted in nothing but prolonged suffering for their patients. Religious conflicts added another layer of torment to the apothecary's existence. The Church taught that disease was often a manifestation of God's will, either as punishment for sin or as a test of faith. Yet the apothecary's very profession was based on the premise that human intervention could alter divine judgment. And this theological contradiction created a constant state of spiritual anxiety for devout practitioners, who wondered whether their healing efforts were aligned with God's plan or working against it. Some sought to resolve this conflict by viewing themselves as instruments of divine mercy, while others were tormented by the possibility that their very calling was sinful. The medieval apothecary workshop was itself a monument to human suffering, its shelves lined with jars containing substances of dubious origin and questionable efficacy. Dried bat wings hung alongside preserved human organs, while powdered unicorn horns shared space with ground pearls and crushed emeralds. The air was thick with the mingled odor of decay, chemicals, and burning herbs, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously nauseating and strangely hypnotic. Visitors often described these workshops as places where the boundary between the natural and supernatural seemed thin, where the desperate came seeking miracles and often left with nothing but empty promises and lighter purses. The tools of the trade were as primitive as they were dangerous. Glass vessels, when available at all, were often crude and prone to shattering, sending sharp fragments flying through the workshop. Metal implements were frequently contaminated with previous preparations, leading to unexpected and sometimes deadly reactions when different substances were mixed. The brutal truth about being a medieval apothecary wasn't just about the constant exposure to lethal substances that slowly poisoned their bodies from within. It wasn't merely the social ostracism, religious persecution, or the primitive working conditions that made their profession so perilous. No, the most devastating aspect was the psychological torment that came with the territory, the crushing weight of responsibility when treatments failed, the constant fear of accusations of witchcraft, and the profound isolation that defined their existence. Picture Thomas the apothecary, hunched over his grinding stone in the pre-dawn darkness of his cramped workshop. The acrid smell of mercury vapor mingles with the musty scent of dried herbs hanging from the rafters above, his hands already showing the telltale tremors of metal poisoning. Work methodically to prepare yet another tincture for a desperate family whose child burns with fever. He knows with grim certainty that he's gambling with both the child's life and his own reputation with every grain of powder he measures. The irony was devastating. These healers who dedicated their lives to alleviating human suffering often found themselves becoming the very embodiment of the pain they sought to cure. Their workshops were chambers of controlled chaos, filled with substances that would make modern toxicologists recoil in horror. Lead oxide for treating wounds, mercury for various ailments, arsenic compounds for skin conditions. Each remedy carried the potential for both healing and harm in equal measure. But perhaps most heartbreaking was the psychological burden they carried. Every failed treatment became a weight upon their conscience. When the blacksmith's wife died, despite weeks of careful ministration, when the merchant's son succumbed to the plague, despite the most expensive remedies, when the Lord's daughter fell victim to a fever that no herb could break, death chipped away at the apothecary's soul. The community's relationship with these healers was complex and often contradictory. In times of health, they were viewed with suspicion, their knowledge of herbs and powders seeming almost supernatural to the common folk. Children would cross themselves when passing the apothecary shop, and mothers would hurry their daughters past the windows where strange vapors leaped from bubbling vessels. Yet when illness struck, these same people would come crawling back, desperate for any remedy, any hope that the mysterious arts of the apothecary might provide salvation. This constant cycle of rejection and desperate need took its toll. Many apothecaries became reclusive figures, finding solace only in their work and the company of fellow practitioners. They developed their own codes, their own ways of communicating that the outside world couldn't understand. In hushed conversations over shared meals, they would discuss their failures as much as their successes, seeking absolution from peers who understood the impossible burden they carried. The religious authorities viewed them with particular suspicion. The church taught that illness was often a punishment from God, a test of faith that should be endured with prayer and penance. The apothecary's intervention seemed to challenge this divine order, suggesting that human knowledge could circumvent God's will. This theological tension placed apothecaries in a precarious position, always walking the fine line between healing and heresy. During the plague years, the psychological pressure reached unbearable levels, as bodies piled in the streets and entire families were wiped out. The apothecaries worked frantically to find some remedy, some combination of herbs and minerals that might stem the tide of death. They tried everything: compounds of gold and silver, exotic spices from distant lands, preparations made from the organs of various animals. Nothing worked. The plague continued its relentless march, and with each failure, the apothecaries felt the weight of their inadequacy more keenly. Some broke under the pressure. Historical records speak of apothecaries who simply disappeared one day, abandoning their shops and their calling to seek solace in monasteries or to live as hermits in the wilderness. Others turned to drink, seeking oblivion in the very alcohol they used as a solvent for their medicines. Still others became obsessed with their work to the point of madness, spending days and nights in futile attempts to discover the perfect cure, universal remedy that would vindicate their life's work. The physical toll of their profession only amplified their psychological suffering. As their bodies slowly succumbed to the poisons they worked with daily, as tremors made precise measurements impossible, and failing eyesight made reading ancient texts a struggle, they faced the bitter irony that they, the healers, were slowly dying from their attempts to heal others. Yet, perhaps the most insidious toll of all was the psychological warfare that medieval apothecaries waged against themselves every single day. Picture this: you're hunched over your workbench at 3 o'clock in the morning, your hands trembling, not from the mercury poisoning, but from the weight of a decision that could damn a soul or save a life. A wealthy merchant's wife lies dying of fever, and her husband has promised you enough gold to feed your family for months if you can cure her. But the remedy that might work requires ingredients you know are tainted, mixed by methods that border on heretical. This was the mental torture chamber that every apothecary inhabited. They weren't just mixing potions, or playing God with incomplete knowledge and tools that belonged in a butcher shop rather than a healer's workshop. The constant second-guessing ate away at their sanity like acid through metal. Did that? Last patient died because the mercury dosage was too high, or because you didn't use enough? Was the failure in your technique, your ingredients, or simply God's will? These questions haunted them through sleepless nights, filled with the screams of those they couldn't save. The isolation was perhaps worse than the physical dangers. While other craftsmen could share their knowledge freely, apothecaries guarded their secrets like dragons hoarding gold, because revealing too much could mean accusations of witchcraft or heresy. They couldn't form guilds or brotherhoods. way blacksmiths or carpenters could. Instead, they worked in solitude, their only companions the ghosts of failed treatments and the ever-present fear of discovery. Many turned to their own concoctions for relief, laudanum. Distilled spirits infused with herbs, anything, to dull the crushing anxiety that came with holding life and death in your poison-stained hands. The irony was bitter. The healers became the most self-medicated members of society, slowly destroying themselves with the very substances they used to treat others. They'd sample their own wares, testing potency and effects, gradually building tolerances that required stronger and stronger doses just to function. The mental strain was compounded by the brutal economics of their trade. Unlike a baker or cobbler whose failures meant hungry bellies or wet feet, an apothecary's mistake meant corpses, and corpses didn't pay their bills. Families of the deceased would often refuse payment, sometimes even demanding compensation for the loss. This financial instability meant that apothecaries lived in constant fear, not just of killing their patients, but of starving their own families in the process. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. The good ones, the apothecaries, who actually cared about their patients, suffered the most.
Oh.
Those who approached their work with genuine compassion and scientific curiosity were the ones who stayed awake at night, replaying every decision, every measurement, every moment where they might have chosen differently. The charlatans and quacks slept soundly, their consciences untroubled by genuine concern for human suffering. The weight of accumulated failure was staggering. Imagine keeping a mental ledger of every person you couldn't save, every child who died despite your best efforts, every mother who never returned home because your remedy proved worse than her disease. These memories piled up like stones in a sack, growing heavier with each passing year, until some apothecaries could barely stand upright under the psychological burden. And the worst part, society demanded that they maintain a facade of confidence and knowledge, even when they felt like frauds stumbling through darkness. Patients expected certainty. Families demanded guarantees, and the church required unwavering faith in divine providence. But inside, most apothecaries were screaming with doubt, their minds fragmenting under the pressure of pretending to know things that no human being could possibly understand with. The tools available to them, the truly tragic figures, were those who started with genuine hope and noble intentions, young apprentices who entered the trade believing they could ease human suffering, only to discover that they were more likely to cause it. The slow realization that their life's work might be doing more harm than good was a special kind of hell, a psychological torture that no amount of mercury or arsenic could match. Some broke entirely, becoming the very madmen that people whispered they might be. Others retreated into rigid ritual and superstition, clinging to familiar procedures not because they worked, but because following established patterns was the only way to maintain any sense of control in a world that seemed determined to punish their efforts to help. The medieval apothecary's mind was a battlefield where hope warred with despair. Knowledge fought ignorance, and the desire to heal struggled. Against the reality of harm, the medieval apothecary stood at a crossroads between healer and pariah, their knowledge of herbs and compounds making them both indispensable and deeply feared by the communities they served. In the shadowy workshops where they practiced their craft, surrounded by bundles of dried plants and vials of mysterious liquids, these early pharmacists walked a razor's edge between salvation and damnation. Their workspaces were cramped, poorly ventilated chambers that reeked of sulfur, mercury, and decay. Clay vessels lined wooden shelves, each containing substances that could heal or kill, depending on the dose. Mortar and pestle work echoed through the day as they ground wolfsbane, hemlock, and foxglove into powders, their hands stained permanent black from handling toxic minerals. The constant exposure to these deadly compounds slowly poisoned their own bodies, leaving many apothecaries with trembling hands, failing eyesight, and shortened lifespans. The social isolation was perhaps even more crushing than the physical. Toll neighbors whispered that apothecaries consorted with dark forces, their ability to both cure and kill seeming supernatural to the superstitious masses. When treatments failed, blame fell swiftly upon the apothecary, often leading to accusations of witchcraft or deliberate poisoning. Many found themselves hauled before ecclesiastical courts where their very knowledge became evidence of heretical practices. The Church viewed their work with deep suspicion, seeing in their chemical transformations an attempt to usurp God's dominion over life and death. Priests railed against those who would seek to heal through earthly means rather than divine intervention, forcing apothecaries to practice in secret or face excommunication. This religious persecution created a culture of secrecy that further fueled public mistrust and fear. Financial pressures added another layer of misery to their existence. The wealthy could afford their services, but demanded guarantees the apothecaries couldn't provide, while the poor, who needed help most, could offer little payment. Many resorted to adulterating their remedies with cheaper, less effective ingredients, knowing that a watered-down medicine was better than none at all. This compromise between ethics and survival haunted many practitioners who watched patients suffer from treatments they knew could be more potent. The knowledge itself was a burden. Passed down through generations of secretive apprenticeships, young apothecaries learned not just which plants healed, but which killed, and in what combinations. They memorized the precise amounts of mercury needed to treat syphilis without causing madness, the exact preparation of antimony that could purge without causing death. This intimate knowledge of poison and cure created a terrible isolation, as they alone understood how thin the line was between medicine and murder. Competition among apothecaries was fierce and often vicious. Trade secrets were guarded jealously, and sabotage was not uncommon. Apprentices were sometimes deliberately taught incorrect formulations to prevent them from setting up rival practices. The constant fear of having one's recipes stolen or one's reputation destroyed created an atmosphere of paranoia that pervaded the profession. The psychological toll of constant failure weighed heavily on these early healers. Most of their patients died anyway, victims of diseases they couldn't understand, with tools that were woefully inadequate. Each death was both a professional failure and a personal tragedy, building layers of guilt and despair that few could escape. Many turned to drink or to their own compounds for solace, adding addiction to their list of afflictions. Yet despite the crushing hardships, the medieval apothecary persevered, driven by a desperate hope that their next preparation might finally unlock the secrets of healing. So, we've journeyed through the darkest corners of medieval apothecary life, through the toxic fumes and poisonous concoctions, through the social persecution and crushing isolation. We've witnessed their struggles with primitive tools and dangerous ingredients, their battles against diseases they barely understood, their constant fight for survival in a world that often viewed them with suspicion and fear. But here's what's truly remarkable about these medieval apothecaries. Despite everything we've explored, despite the brutal reality of their existence, they never stopped trying. They never stopped searching for cures, for answers, for ways to heal the suffering around them. Even when their bodies were slowly being poisoned by mercury and lead. Even when they were accused of witchcraft for their knowledge. Even when they faced economic ruin and social ostracism, they persisted in their crude workshops. Surrounded by the stench of sulfur and the glow of dangerous flames, these apothecaries were laying the groundwork for modern medicine. Every failed experiment, every painful lesson learned through trial and error, every advancement made at great personal cost was a stepping stone toward the medical knowledge we take for granted today. Their legacy lives on in every pharmacy, every hospital, every medical breakthrough that saves lives, the antibiotics that cure infections, the pain relievers that ease suffering, the surgical techniques that repair broken bodies. All of these miracles of modern medicine can trace their origins back to those brave souls who dared to experiment with the mysteries of healing in an age of darkness and superstition. When they ground their herbs by candlelight, when they mixed their potions despite the toxic vapors, when they treated plague victims knowing they might contract the disease themselves. They were writing the first chapters of medical history with their own blood, sweat, and sacrifice. So, as we reach the end of our exploration into this brutal world, let us remember that the next time you walk into a modern pharmacy, when you receive medical care that saves your life or eases your pain, You are benefiting from the courage and dedication of countless medieval apothecaries who suffered and died so that future generations might live healthier, longer lives. Their workshop may have been dark and dangerous, their tools primitive, their understanding incomplete, but their spirit of inquiry and their dedication to healing burns on in every medical professional who follows in their footsteps. The brutal reality of being a medieval apothecary was indeed harsh beyond our modern comprehension. But from that brutality emerged the seeds of hope that continue to flourish in our world today.